When I first started playing Final Fantasy XIV, one of my early disappointments was how apparently formulaic its main casts of villains appeared to be. Both the Garleans and the Ascians, through their association, seemed to have the simple-minded goal of spreading destruction and darkness wherever they go, and that's all the motivation we needed to oppose them. To some extent, this remains true throughout A Realm Reborn up to Stormblood. To be clear, there are fantastic stories to be found within each of these expansions, but it wasn't until Shadowbringers that we would see the main villains of the Hydaelyn Zodiark storyline fully fleshed out. It would take a tremendously long time to cover all of the pivotal story moments that culminated in my newly found appreciation for the role that the Ascians and Garleans play in this universe. Today I'd like to talk in particular about how Endwalker brought about a tremendously unexpected last-minute twist to the Garlean plotline. When we're first introduced to the Garleans, we see their influence in Eorzea through the 14th Legion, led by Gaius van Baelzar, together with his three generals, Ratatin Sarvina, Nero Tolskeva, and Livia Junius. Working in tandem with the Ascians, they succeed in coercing several beast tribes to summon primals that would be used to power the Ultima weapon. An imperialist villain is pretty much standard fare for a Final Fantasy game by now. I can only imagine that with the limited time and resources available to get FF14 back on its feet, there had to be some concessions in constructing a perfectly complex narrative. Nevertheless, they did a great job laying a foundation for several plot threads which could be developed further on when time allows. By the end of Stormblood, we're reintroduced to Gaius, as it is revealed that he survived the events of the Praetorium. Having realized that his invasion of Eorzea was in fact only a part of a greater plan by the Ascians, he channels the contempt at being manipulated into revenge. While the Warrior of Light is confronting the Ascian threat in Norvrent, Gaius leads a rebellion against his successors in the Garlean invasion of Eorzea. The ever-evolving technological prowess of the Garleans results in the construction of several more weapons, drawing inspiration from the Ultima weapon. These are the Ruby, Sapphire, Emerald, and Diamond weapons. Each of these weapons are piloted by a skilled regiment of Garlean orphans. Before his defection, Gaius had played a fatherly role in these children's lives, and it brings him tremendous anguish to meet them on the battlefield. Through the Sorrow of Warlit questline in Shadowbringers, the stakes of armed conflict with the Garleans are made explicitly clear. Neither side can avoid conflict, and those who volunteer to fight for their homeland and those who are conscripted to fight against their will can meet the same end in war. There is a line from the Stormblood soundtrack in the song Revolutions that captures the essence of this conflict perfectly. One kingdom's fall is another kingdom's freedom. One sovereign's war is another sovereign's peace, and one mother's pride is another mother's sorrow. Going into Endwalker, I had no idea where the conflict with the Garleans would be taken from here. We as the player had received scarce information about the results of the ongoing civil war for command of the Garlean throne, aside from the fact that Xenos was back in play. After all, the war was tremendously overshadowed by the promised threat of the final days. I expected that we might roll up to Garlemald and throw down an open conflict, but by the time we arrived there in Endwalker, it was like nothing I could have ever predicted. All that was left of Garlemald was a wasteland guarded by an astonishingly weak defensive army, and it was populated by the families and the sick that hadn't been sent off to war. In the brief interactions with the Garlean civilians that are willing to talk, we come to learn that they are heavily reliant on heaters powered by ceruleum to stave off the climate. Damaging a heater or running out of ceruleum fuel is almost a guaranteed death sentence. As well, since the civilians have been cut off from outside communication, they cling to their radios for hope of receiving information which might tell them the proper course of action. We come to learn later that these radios also serve a dual purpose as a more literal sense of protection by stopping the tempering in their proximity. Having been exposed to propaganda for so long, the Garleans are hesitant to receive aid from Eorzeans. Having developed his skills as a diplomat, Alphino is quick to catch on to this and accepts the abundance of cautions they must take to not appear as untrustworthy. Nevertheless, as he and Alize come to realize, they could never take complete control of the situation without a loss of life. Tragically, some civilians would rather measure their odds against roving monsters in the cold rather than submit themselves to the Eorzeans. We see their hostility reflected not only to the Eorzeans, but also towards other Garleans as well. Players who are familiar with the popular game This War of Mine may recognize some thematic overlap. This War of Mine takes place in a fictional war meant to serve as an allegory to the living conditions of Bosnian civilians during the 1992 to 1996 siege of Sarajevo. In this game, the player contends with numerous moral dilemmas which involve taking resources from fellow countrymen to ensure one's own survival. I think that the reason the Garlemald quests in Endwalker stand out to me is that a similar level of narrative complexity is on display here. For the majority of the game, very little concern, if any at all, has been seriously considered for the fate of the Garlean civilians. All that the Eorzeans have to offer are vague promises of freedom and liberation without considering the basic necessities they require to manage a society while maintaining their sovereignty. When you first encounter the Garlean soldier Julius, he is stealing provisions rather than attempting to engage in combat. Later on, the parley between Alphino and Commander Quintus of the First Legion falls through due to desperation on the commander's part. Since he has no fighting chance, his only option is to forsake his morals by ensnaring Alphino and Alize to use as leverage, as he holds out hope for the promise of reinforcements from the 10th Legion. Upon learning after the fact that the 10th Legion has committed itself to a truce with the Eorzean alliance, he has no choice but to accept that Garlemald as he knows it will cease to exist, and that his honor can't be reclaimed. Instead, Garlemald will be subject to the future which Eorzea envisions, and so he decides to take his own life in order to die with his concept of country. In this moment, Julius and his comrades represent the next path for Garlemald. Unlike his commander, Julius is warmed to the reception of Eorzeans through Alphino and Alize's concerted effort to understand his tragedy and appreciate his desire to respect the old ideals of his country. The story of the Garlean invasion of Eorzea has come a long way since release, and it has landed a satisfying payoff. While most of what I talked about in this video regards the events of Endwalker, there are certainly small moments to be found throughout other expansions as well, although I tend to think that the majority of the Garlean conflict in Stormblood was somewhat overshadowed by setting up Xenos as an antagonist. The relationship between Yotsuyu and Asahi, for example, is a great story about how an occupying force can evergreen their conquest by assimilating a younger generation. But that topic deserves a video unto itself, and I'll cover that another day. As I've said, a technologically advanced imperialist superpower is nothing new to the Final Fantasy franchise, and I would argue that in many games their one-dimensionality is the lowest common denominator. I had my worries early on that this might be the case for FF14 as well. I'm so glad to have been proven wrong and that we could experience this story. That brings me to the end of my video today. If you like this video and the content I'm putting out, I would greatly appreciate it if you could like this video, share it around, and subscribe if you want to stay up to date. I'm still starting up this channel, so any little bit goes a long way. If there's a topic you're interested in that you'd like me to cover, please leave it in the comments below, and if I go forward with it, I'll be sure to credit you in my next video. Take care everyone, and I'll see you again in no time at all.